In this episode, we talk about Indo-China relations post the Galwan clash. We also talk about Delhi CM Arvind Kejriwal approaching the Supreme Court seeking an urgent hearing. But first, we give you a detailed update on the NEET UG row. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda and you are listening to 3 Things, the Indian Express news show. Ever since the results were declared earlier this month, the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test for Undergraduate Medical Studies or NEET has been shrouded in controversy. From speculations of a paper leak to unfair practices at certain testing centers, the examination has been under scrutiny with the CBI now probing the matter. And while questions were being raised regarding the functioning of the National Testing Agency, last week its chief was removed from his post and 3 other exams were either cancelled or postponed. To understand the recent developments concerning these national examinations, we have Indian Express's National Education Editor Ritika Chopra joining us. Ritika, can you begin by telling us what are the kind of irregularities that have now come to light about the NEET UG examination?
So there are a bunch of things. Right after the NEET UG was held on the 5th of May, the Bihar police on the 6th or the 7th announced that it had made some arrests on the suspicion that some candidates had access to the NEET UG paper beforehand. So this was immediately after the paper was held, but we didn't hear much on this after that, at least not nationally. Once the NEET UG results were declared on the 4th of June, in fact, that was the day of the Lok Sabha results, almost immediately after that, candidates started pointing out the fact that the marks seemed a little inflated. There were a large number of candidates who had scored well. And of course, the biggest sign, or rather that reflected in the number, just the sheer number of candidates who had topped NEET this year, which was 67, and never before in NEET's history had 67 candidates topped the exam, and they all 67 scored a perfect score of 720 out of 720. So that's where I think, even though Bihar police had right after the exam announced the arrest, but this thing really started snowballing after the declaration of results and candidates taking to social media to point out that the marks scored seemed inflated, and especially the fact that there was a huge number of candidates, sort of a record number of candidates scoring a perfect score of 720. When that was being discussed, in fact, this was a report that Express had first. Diksha Theory of IndianExpress.com had done the story first, was that of the 67, as many as 44 candidates had scored a perfect score because they were awarded grace marks for answering a question incorrectly.
Right, and this was because the answer to a question was different in 2 versions of an NCERT textbook. And as a result, 44 candidates received an additional 5 marks. Plus 1,563 candidates were given grace marks because the exam started late at their center, and there were also reports of unfair practices at 2 centers in Godhra. So there were clearly quite a few issues. Talk about the steps that the government has taken since the controversy first came to light.
So the first thing that the government did admit was that maybe the grace marks awarded to those 1,563 candidates to compensate them for loss of time, maybe that was not the right approach. So the NTA had set up a committee to review that, and that committee recommended, withdrawal of grace marks and a retest for all of these candidates, and NTA accepted that. And the government eventually informed the Supreme Court of this approach, and the court accepted it. That is where the government and the NTA was willing to concede to an error. But as far as allegations of, marks inflation and leak are concerned, the government was initially quite defensive. And it said that, there was no corruption, no question of corruption. But in the last 1 week, the situation has changed pretty rapidly. And that actually started with, again, another report broken by the Express by our colleague Santosh Singh in Bihar, where he spoke with the economic offences unit of the Bihar government. If you remember, I'd said that the Bihar police was probing this, but this probe was handed over to EOU in Bihar. And EOU basically indicating, even as the education ministry and the education minister was denying any kind of corruption in the conduct of NEET. But at the same time, interestingly, the EOU in Bihar went ahead and said that their investigation, which was almost a month old by that time, did suggest a paper leak. And that was essentially the turning point for this controversy.
And Ritika, tell us, what has the government acknowledged since then? What are the things that it has admitted to?
So it has acknowledged quote-unquote errors, hasn't directly referred to it as a paper leak as far as the Bihar situation is concerned. Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has been consistently calling it as errors limited to specialized or specific locations. But even though it hasn't made any decision with regard to a retest, it has debarred 17 candidates in Bihar and 30 candidates in Godhra since then. That's of course one action pertaining specifically to NEET UG. But there's been no decision as far as retest. But simultaneously, even as the government is trying to deal with the blowback with regard to NEET UG, it has cancelled a very big public examination called UGC-NET. This exam is key to finding entry-level teaching jobs in universities and again key to getting admissions, PhD admission across universities. It had to cancel that because there was evidence of a paper leak there. And just a few days right after that, it had to postpone 2 more exams. One is NEET PG, which was to be held Sunday. And it also had to postpone the CSIR UGC-NET, which is essentially very similar to UGC-NET, except that it's meant for candidates who want a teaching job in sciences in universities, while UGC-NET is for all other disciplines except sciences. So overall, what happened is that, now the government, of course, has debarred candidates in Bihar and Godhra. No decision on retests, but also had to cancel one exam. The other 2 that were postponed was on the suspicion of leak, even though they had no evidence of it. And most importantly, in all this, it may be to signal some kind of accountability. It transferred the NTA chief, Subodh Kumar Singh, and Pradeep Singh Khairala has taken over as the NTA chief. So that is one big move, aside from the cancellation that the government made in a bid to inspire confidence, to signal that it's serious about the quote-unquote errors and problems within NTA. It has also set up a high-level committee headed by former ISRO chairperson K. Radhakrishnan. It's an 8-member committee which has been tasked to come up with a roadmap for examination reforms and also review the functioning and structure of NTA.
Okay, so a lot of changes that you write will affect close to 13 lakh candidates. But when we talk about the postponement of the NEET PG and the CSIR NET, has that been done as a precautionary measure? What reasons has the government given for that?
So our sources tell us that, the government noticed, even though there were no inputs from MHA and no evidence to prove this, but there were many messages sort of circulating on social media, on chatting platforms, that apparently papers for these 2 exams too were available for a certain price. So even as the government was not able to verify this and not sure how authentic this information was, but as a matter of abundant precaution, first, the Education Ministry told the NTA to postpone the CSIR UGC-NET and hold it on another day. Our sources tell us that obviously if, as a matter of abundant precaution, if you're going to postpone the exam, NTA was also told to, whenever it holds this paper, to do it with a new one so that there is no room for any doubt as far as the integrity of the exam is concerned. But just a day later, the government then postponed the NEET PG. This is not conducted by NTA or Education Ministry. This is conducted directly by the Health Ministry. The Health Ministry, interestingly, was more forthcoming about its reason to postpone it. So while our sources told us that, it was on the suspicion of the paper having been leaked online that the government had told NTA to postpone CSIR NET, but officially NTA had said in its release that this was for logistical reasons, unavoidable circumstances and logistical reasons. However, the Health Ministry's press release does make it clear that there were rumors to the effect that the integrity of the exam may have been compromised, and to ensure that the processes were still robust, this exam was being postponed.
And you mentioned how an expert committee has also been set up to overhaul the NTA. Can you tell us what we know about this committee so far and what will it be looking into?
So this decision, before the NTA chief was moved out, on Thursday, Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan had held a press conference in which he took quote-unquote moral responsibility for what had gone wrong with the conduct of NEET UG. And at that time, he had assured that action would be taken against whoever is responsible, no matter how senior, within the NTA system. Then within 48 hours or approximately 48 hours later, the NTA chief was moved out. But at that press conference, the education minister had also announced that a committee would be set up to look into what went wrong. Or rather, not specifically look into this case in particular, but using this as an opportunity to look at the processes, the examination process of the NTA, its systems, its protocols, its structure also, and review all of this and suggest a roadmap for reforms. So on Saturday evening, 2 days later, the government notified this committee. And it's an 8-member committee, as I had mentioned, and it has some heavyweights as members of this committee. This is ISRO chairperson, K. Radhakrishnan, who's also the chairperson of the IIT Kanpur Board of Governors. You have Randeep Guleria, former AIIMS director. He has headed one of the best medical colleges in the country. And there are others from the IIT system, another example being Professor Aditya Mittal. He obviously has been roped in because he was the chairperson of the JEE Advanced in 2018 when IIT Delhi had conducted the exam. So he has an idea of what it takes to have robust process and to have everything in place to conduct a competitive exam. And this committee, by the way, has been tasked to submit its report in 2 months. So the government's hoping that once this report is submitted, those reforms could be implemented before the next batch of big exams that NTA has to conduct in December.
And Ritika, talk about the kind of political reactions this controversy has prompted and the kind of things that the opposition leaders have been saying.
So the Congress, for instance, has held several press conferences on it. Rahul Gandhi has met NEET candidates and he has announced that he would be taking this issue up in Parliament. So this issue, which actually started with candidates, has kind of snowballed into a political storm for the government. And the upcoming parliament session, which starts on Monday, is expected to see quite a few disruptions as the opposition tries to raise this issue. For now, the opposition has been seeking a retest and some form of accountability from the government. There are demands that heads should roll. There have been demands for even resignation of Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan.
And as someone who has been reporting on the education sector, what kind of concerns do you think all this raises?
So there have been leaks in the past, but the surge in the number of such instances, especially after the pandemic, one doesn't really know an explanation for this, but I guess once a leak happens, in this day and age, in the age of digital media, a leak essentially is never really a local problem. Once a paper is leaked, the news as well as the questions, they are available, spreads like wildfire. And there have been several instances of it, as we can see in the last 2 years, the number of job recruitment exams that have been cancelled across states, states especially like UP, Rajasthan, which have actually witnessed leaks of the same exam, over and over again. It's been a source of huge embarrassment for many state governments. Very recently, the Indian Express also did a deep dive and found that just sort of recapping the number of exams that had been leaked in the last 5 years, and almost 1 crore candidates had been affected by it. What this does is that, it hurts its main stakeholder, which is the youth, which are the candidates who are waiting to take these tests. You have to remember, in a country like ours, there is a huge premium on preparing and cracking entrance exams, preparing and cracking recruitment exams. Families invest a lot of money in it. Candidates invest a lot of time in it. So with every cancellation, it almost is a waste of the time that you've put in the past. Because remember, not every time an exam is cancelled does a retest happen immediately. That's especially in the context of some of the state exams where candidates have had to wait up to a year, 2 years for exams to be reheld. And that's time that they cannot get back. So it hurts them a lot. And this is definitely worrying. The government has brought a new law to deal with paper leaks. This law was passed in February. Unfortunately, this law was not, even though it was passed in February and had the President's assent, it was not notified. It was notified very recently after this NEET UG matter was discovered. So provisions of that law, which are effective from the 21st of June, in fact, will not be applicable to this case in particular. It has very stringent provisions. But overall, I mean, this is not a good sign for the education system. Like I said, that, its ramifications are pretty wide and just demoralizes, the youth, especially in a country, like I said, where there is this huge premium on cracking these exams.
And next we talk about Indo-China relations. Earlier this month, the 15th of June marked 4 years since the deadly Galwan clash that killed 20 Indian soldiers. The clash, of course, took place between Indian and Chinese soldiers who had transgressed along at least 4 points on the line of actual control (LAC) in eastern Ladakh a few weeks earlier. Since then, about 50,000 to 60,000 troops have remained deployed on each side of the border, and repeated rounds of military and diplomatic talks have failed to resolve the conflict. With the Modi government having begun its third term and with the recent developments appearing to offer hope, we are joined by the Indian Express's Diplomatic Affairs editor Shubhajit Roy to discuss the crisis and the current state of Indo-China relations. Shubhajit, for those who might not remember, can you begin by talking about the Galwan clash that killed 20 Indian soldiers?
Yeah, so about 4 years ago, the border standoff between Indian and Chinese troops began in late April, early May. And, it came to a point where there were clashes at Galwan Valley on 15th of June 2020. In which about 20 Indian soldiers were killed, including a colonel rank officer from the Indian side. On the Chinese side, the Chinese never declared their casualty count, and they later identified 4 Chinese soldiers, who had been killed in those bloody clashes. And that was the first time since, 1975 that there were deaths on the India-China border since 1975. So essentially, it was a big sort of major shift where India-China border was said to be peaceful in the last 40, 50 years. But that record was broken in 2020. So that was the Galwan incident, Galwan clashes as we know today.
And how would you say that incident affected China's ties with India? What would you say has changed after that?
So, there was this border standoff where 50,000 to 60,000 troops from both sides, from Indian side as well as the Chinese side, have been deployed on both sides of the border along the India-China line of actual control. So that was the sort of most offensive and defensive positions that have been taken by the Indian side as well as the Chinese side since the war between the two countries. So after that, this Galwan incident, the Indian side linked it to the overall relationship. So the bilateral ties between India and China have been adversely impacted by the border situation, because there is now tension in the border that strain the ties between the two countries. And that's how it has now impacted the relationship politically. There are no visits, there are no talks that have happened, except for the talks that have happened at the military and the diplomatic level to resolve the border standoff. So even after 4 years, more than 4 years now, as I said earlier, that the border standoff started in early May. And since then, it's been more than 4 years, and still there's no resolution in sight to the border standoff.
Yeah, although now more than 4 years later, some recent comments made by Indian and Chinese leaders do give a slight impression that they might be interested in mending the relationship between the two sides. Could you talk about what these comments have been?
Yeah, so, what happened was in the last couple of months, there were few important and comments that were made. First was in April by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, in an interview to Newsweek magazine, said during the interview that for India, the relationship with China is important and significant. And then he went on to talk about how we need to urgently address the prolonged situation on our borders so that the abnormality in our bilateral interactions can be put behind us. So, how it was framed and how it was perceived by the Chinese side was, that the Indian side is keen to resolve the border dispute. So the Chinese obviously reacted positively to the Prime Minister's framing of the border dispute. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, in fact, said that the relationship between India and China was about more than the boundary situation. And the two countries maintained close communication through diplomatic and military channels on handling issues related to the border situation and have made positive progress. So that was the sort of comment or reaction that came from the Chinese government. After that, in May this year, External Affairs Minister S. Shashank, he expressed hope for resolving the remaining issues with China amid the border standoff in Ladakh. In fact, he said in an interview to PTI, the news agency, that these outstanding issues primarily revolved around patrolling rights and patrolling abilities. Now, he was essentially limiting the dispute to patrolling rights and patrolling abilities, which was seen as a nuancing of the Indian position, because so far India had maintained that it's all about disengagement and de-escalation. So moving away from that, the Chinese side perceived it as a positive sort of development. And when Jaishankar was asked about the likely timeline for resolving these issues, he basically said that the Prime Minister had provided a big picture perspective. So when Jaishankar was asked about the likely timeline for resolving these issues, he essentially said that the Prime Minister had provided a big picture perspective. So all in all, the Chinese government saw this as positively as they could after 4 years of the standoff.
Though, Shubhajit, besides the talks regarding the LAC, there have been other issues as well. Recently, an exchange of messages between PM Modi and Taiwan's president on social media site X became somewhat of a bone of contention for China. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so, after Prime Minister Modi won the election and he was set to take charge in his third term, there were these exchange of messages between the Indian Prime Minister and Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te on the social media platform X, which was the first public interaction between the two leaders, where the Taiwanese president, he congratulated the Indian Prime Minister on his re-election, and the Indian Prime Minister said thank you. So that was the broad, takeaway from those exchange of messages. But that angered the Chinese, who saw this as a provocation because they saw India sort of moving away from the One China policy and possibly engaging with the Taiwanese at the political level. So that was a red line for the Chinese, and they lodged a protest, and they also expressed their anger quite publicly.
Also, recently, a US delegation met with the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala. Can you tell our listeners about the comments that the delegation made and what were the reactions to it?
Yeah. So just this week, a 7-member bipartisan delegation of the US Congress, they met the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala, and where former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that while the Tibetan spiritual leader's legacy will live forever, Chinese President Xi Jinping will be gone and nobody will give him credit for anything. And a day later, this delegation also met Prime Minister Narendra Modi, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, NSA Ajit Doval. In that sense, the Chinese sort of again saw this as the Indian side engaging with the Tibetans and the US also moving away from the One China policy. So the Chinese reacted sharply and urged the US to adhere to its commitments of recognizing Xinjiang as part of China and not supporting Xinjiang's independence. Now, China refers to Tibet as Xinjiang. Nancy Pelosi was the US House of Representatives Speaker. She had ignored warnings from Beijing about 2 years ago to visit Taiwan in August 2022. So this particular meeting between the US congressional delegation and the Dalai Lama really sparked another round of protests by the Chinese to the Indians as well as the Americans.
And Shubhajit, considering all this, what can we expect for the future regarding China-India relations?
So, these developments, if they read together, some analysts we believe that India has clearly shown its intent on resolving the border situation through the interviews by the Prime Minister and External Affairs Minister Shashank. But it has also sent out a signal that through Pelosi's visit to the Dalai Lama, that they are willing to use Tibet as a leverage, as well as the public exchange of messages with the Taiwanese president as another leverage that India holds. There is another school of thought which believes that while Delhi had initially wanted to resolve the border situation after the Lok Sabha election, it has changed its mind after the NDA got a weaker than expected mandate, because the government is wary of criticism that any reconciliation that was on India's terms might draw from the opposition. Now, obviously, these are the analyses that have come about, and we have to see in the next few months, few weeks, whether Indian and Chinese officials are able to resolve the border situation and move forward on the bilateral front.
And in the end, we talk about Arvind Kejriwal. Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal yesterday approached the Supreme Court challenging the Delhi High Court order that put the trial court order of granting him bail in the liquor policy scam case on hold. Sources told Indian Express's Ananta Krishnan Ji that Kejriwal's lawyers are seeking an urgent hearing of the matter. The Delhi High Court had on June 21 put on hold the June 20 order of the trial court granting bail to the Delhi Chief Minister. The High Court said it was reserving its order on the Enforcement Directorate's plea seeking a stay on the bail order. It also issued notice to Kejriwal on the ED's main petition challenging the trial court's Thursday order and listed it for July 10. In his report, Ananta Krishnan Ji writes that on June 20, Special Judge Nyay Bindu of Rouse Avenue Court had granted regular bail to Kejriwal and declined the ED's plea to keep the bail order in abeyance for 48 hours. This prompted the ED to approach the High Court. The single-judge bench of Justice Sudhir Kumar Jain, who heard the ED's prayer and counter-arguments by Kejriwal's counsel, said that the arguments of both the sides were heard, and until the final order is pronounced on the stay application, the trial court's order will remain stayed. The High Court said it wants to go through the entire record and the impugned judgment and will pronounce its verdict on the stay application in 2-3 days. It permitted both the parties to file short written submissions by June 24. The Enforcement Directorate had arrested Kejriwal on money laundering charges in connection with the excise policy scam case on March 21 this year. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank Bhargava and me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.